Have you ever looked at the phone, hoping it might ring, only to be met with silence? Maybe you've left a message that still hasn't been returned. Or you've had a family dinner where your children barely looked up from their phones. It's not just the silence that stings, it's the feeling of being invisible. You spent years raising them, caring for them, putting them first. And now, it feels like you're no longer part of the picture. It hurts, doesn't it? And it's confusing too. You ask yourself, where did I go wrong? I gave them everything. I loved them unconditionally. And yet here you are, feeling left out or disrespected. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. So many older parents feel this way, but most don't talk about it out loud. It's a quiet pain, one carried behind closed doors. But here's something I want you to remember. Feeling ignored or disrespected by your children doesn't mean your value has disappeared. And you don't have to just sit and accept it. There are things you can do, real, practical things, to bring peace back into your life, to find purpose, and yes, even to gently rebuild those broken connections. It's not about yelling or blaming or begging. It's about wise actions, small changes, and powerful shifts in how you carry yourself. So today, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what you can do when your kids ignore you, or worse, no longer seem to respect you. I'll be sharing 8 powerful insights, and each one can help you feel stronger, calmer, and more in control again. We're going to start with something very simple, but incredibly important. Let's begin with this. When you feel dismissed or disrespected, don't let anger take the wheel. I know, it's easier said than done. When your child says something hurtful or just acts like you're not even there, it can feel like a slap in the face. The first instinct might be to snap back, to say, "After all I've done for you, this is how you treat me?" But reacting in anger almost always pushes people further away. Let me share a story with you. Mr. Walker, a retired high school teacher in his early 70s, found himself in this exact situation. His 2 adult kids hardly ever visited. And when they did, it was like they were doing him a favor. They'd scroll through their phones during dinner, offer short answers to his questions, and leave after 20 minutes. One day, after his son ignored yet another phone call, Mr. Walker nearly picked up the phone and yelled, "Do you even care about me anymore?" But something stopped him. Instead, he put on his walking shoes and took a long, quiet walk through the park. As he walked beneath the trees, his mind drifted back to his days in the classroom, the laughter of students, the field trips, the years of helping young people grow. Then he thought about the sacrifices he had made for his family, the extra jobs, the sleepless nights, the home-cooked meals. And finally, he remembered the joy of hearing his daughter's first words, or teaching his son to ride a bike. In that quiet moment, Mr. Walker realized something powerful. His worth didn't disappear just because his kids weren't calling. His value came from the life he had lived, the kindness he had shown, and the love he had given. His dignity wasn't something they could take away. That moment of calm helped him more than any argument would have. And over time, with a clearer mind, he found a better way to connect. He didn't need to explode to feel seen. He just needed to come back to himself. So if you're feeling overlooked or rejected, take a breath. Take a walk. Take a pause before reacting. Don't let their behavior define your self-worth. The clearer your mind is, the stronger you'll be. And believe it or not, people respond differently when you carry yourself with calm confidence. Now, let's talk about something else that can make an enormous difference. Shifting the focus back to yourself. I know that might sound selfish at first, but it's not. When you feel ignored, the natural response is to wait. To wait for the phone to ring, to wait for the doorbell, to wait for someone to finally say, "I miss you." But waiting puts your happiness in someone else's hands. And that's no way to live. Take Mrs. Harris, for example. She lost her husband a few years ago, and her kids promised they'd visit often. But those visits grew farther and farther apart. First it was weekly, then monthly, then just holidays. She spent a lot of time sitting in her kitchen, staring at her phone, hoping it would ring. It didn't. One morning, something inside her shifted. She stood up, went to the pantry, pulled out a dusty packet of flower seeds, and walked outside. She hadn't touched the garden in years. At first, she just poked around. But before long, she was planting, watering, pulling weeds. It felt good to move, to care for something again. Pretty soon, she joined a local gardening club. She made new friends, people who looked forward to seeing her each week. Her days started filling up with laughter, shared stories, even potlucks with fresh veggies from her garden. One afternoon, out of nowhere, her daughter called. "Mom," she said, "you sound so different lately. So happy. What's changed?" And just like that, the door began to reopen. Not because she begged or complained, but because her energy had changed. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She had chosen herself. There's a quiet power in that. When you find a purpose, whether it's gardening, painting, volunteering, joining a book club, you stop being defined by what others give or withhold. You create joy on your own terms. And people notice that. Your kids notice that. A fulfilled parent is hard to ignore. So ask yourself, what have you always wanted to try? What lights you up? What did you used to enjoy but put aside for years? It's never too late to rediscover your spark. And when you do, your life becomes richer, not just for you, but for everyone around you. When you carry yourself with calm and live with purpose, you become magnetic. You stop chasing after your children's attention, and instead, you quietly draw it back, without saying a word. Now that you've seen how pausing instead of reacting in anger can protect your dignity, and how finding your own joy can make you radiant again, let's talk about the next thing that truly transforms these relationships. Because when your heart is calm and your life feels full again, you begin to see everything more clearly, including how you speak to the people who matter most. And that brings us to something that can change the entire tone of your relationship with your children: how you express your feelings. When someone we love pulls away or treats us poorly, it's so tempting to lash out. You might feel the urge to say, period. Why don't you ever call me? Don't you care anymore? It comes from a place of hurt, of course. But here's the hard truth. Accusations rarely bring people closer. They make people defensive. And that's the last thing we want. So instead of going on the offense, try something softer, something more honest and heartfelt. It doesn't mean you're being weak. It means you're being wise. Take Mr. Johnson, for example. A retired carpenter in his late 60s, Mr. Johnson hadn't heard from his son, Eric, in over 3 months. No calls, no visits, nothing. Every day, he looked out the window, hoping to see that familiar car in the driveway. And every day, his heart sank a little more. At one point, he picked up the phone, ready to leave a message full of frustration. But then he stopped. He sat down, took a breath, and decided to write a letter instead. In the letter, he didn't scold or accuse. He simply wrote, "Eric, I've been thinking about you lately. I miss hearing your voice, and I miss our talks. I just wanted you to know I'm always here and I'm proud of you." That was it. No guilt, no drama, just love. A few days later, the phone rang. It was Eric. That letter had touched him deeply. He admitted he'd been overwhelmed with work and hadn't realized how much time had slipped by. That one simple message reopened a door that had quietly been closing for years. Words carry incredible power. And when you choose ones that reflect care and vulnerability, rather than frustration and blame, you create space for healing. So if you're wondering what to say, try this. "I miss spending time with you. I'd love to hear your voice." Or even just, "I'm thinking about you today." These words open hearts, not shut them down. Now let's talk about something else that's just as important: Respect. Everyone wants it. But here's something many of us learn too late in life. Respect isn't just something we ask for. It's something we model. And sometimes to be respected, you have to start by respecting yourself. Mrs. Mitchell knew this well. She was a retired nurse in her 70s, always the one who held her family together. Her son, Alex, had grown into a man who often took her for granted. He'd stop by only when he needed help, money, babysitting, or just someone to vent to. He rarely said thank you, and he never asked how she was doing. She kept telling herself, "He's just busy. He'll change." But over time, the visits felt more like demands than connection. One day, after Alex dropped off his kids without asking, again, Mrs. Mitchell made a choice. She calmly said, "Period. Alex, I love you, but I'm not available today. I have plans." He was shocked, a little irritated even, but she didn't budge. From that point on, she began carving out space for herself, joining a book club, attending yoga at the senior center, reconnecting with an old friend from nursing school. She stopped rearranging her life around Alex's chaos. At first, he pulled away. But then something interesting happened. He started asking, "Hey, Mom, do you have time to talk?" He began showing up not just when he needed something, but just to say hello. Her boundaries had changed everything, not by pushing him away, but by showing him how she expected to be treated. Respect is a two-way street. If you're constantly bending over backward to please someone who never gives back, what message are you sending? That your time doesn't matter? That your feelings don't count? But when you gently say, "This is what I'm okay with, and this is what I'm not," you show your children what healthy love looks like. You teach them how to treat you, not through anger or punishment, but through clarity and consistency. And it doesn't stop there. Once you start honoring your own needs, something else begins to shift. You begin leading by example. And let me tell you, there is no more powerful teacher than example. That's exactly what happened with Mr. Edwards. He'd worked in a factory most of his life, raised 3 kids, and never asked for much. As he got older, the visits became fewer, the calls shorter. His children would show up, barely lift their heads from their phones, eat dinner in silence, then head out the door. It broke his heart. But he didn't yell. He didn't guilt-trip them. Instead, he chose to show them something different. Every time they walked through that door, he greeted them with a smile. "It's so good to see you," he'd say. He asked about their lives and really listened, even when the answers were short. And when they forgot his birthday one year, he didn't sulk. He simply sent them a message, period. "Hope you're doing well. I miss you." Over time, they noticed. They saw his patience, his kindness, his quiet strength. And slowly they started to come around. The visits grew longer. One of his sons brought his own kids over to spend the afternoon. His daughter even asked, "Dad, how do you stay so calm through everything?" He had become a rock in their lives, a silent example of the very respect he hoped to receive. People don't always change because we tell them to. Sometimes they change because we show them how. When you treat your children and yourself with gentleness, patience, and grace, it begins to shift the atmosphere. It may not happen overnight, but the seeds you plant with your example can grow into something beautiful. And here's another thing that matters more than you might think: staying financially independent. Now, I know money isn't everything, but when your children see that you can manage your affairs with confidence, it changes the way they see you. Not as someone who needs to be taken care of, but as someone who stands tall. Mr. and Mrs. Miller understood this. After retiring, they sold their big house and downsized to a cozy home that fit their needs. They kept their expenses low, budgeted carefully, and lived comfortably on their retirement savings. They didn't flash money around, but they also didn't call their children for help every time a bill came in. At first, their kids didn't say much. But slowly, they started noticing. "Mom, how did you guys make it all work?" one daughter asked. "Can you help me figure out my retirement plan?" They began to admire their parents not just as caregivers, but as wise adults with experience and insight. You don't have to be rich to earn this kind of respect. You just have to be responsible. When you make the most of what you have, when you live within your means and plan ahead, you send a powerful message. I'm capable. I'm stable. I'm still leading my own life. And that, more than anything, changes the dynamic. Your children stop seeing you as someone fading away. They start seeing you as someone strong, dependable, and worth listening to. Because when you carry yourself with strength and self-respect, everything starts to feel different. Not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. And once you begin standing on your own 2 feet emotionally and financially, you also gain the clarity to face something that many people avoid: forgiveness. Now, I want to say this carefully because I know how deep the wounds can go. If your child has ignored you for years, spoken to you harshly, or treated you like you don't matter, the pain can sit heavy in your chest. And you might wonder, why should I forgive someone who's made me feel this way? But here's the truth. Forgiveness isn't something you give because the other person deserves it. Forgiveness is something you give yourself because you deserve peace. Mrs. Bennett, a retired artist, wrestled with this for years. Her daughter, Claire, had slowly become more distant, at first skipping calls, then family holidays, then full years with barely a word. And like many parents, Mrs. Bennett spent a long time wondering if she had done something wrong. She replayed old conversations, questioned her parenting, and carried a quiet shame that weighed her down. One morning, she sat at her kitchen table, looked out the window, and felt something shift. She picked up a pen and wrote Claire a letter. It wasn't angry or bitter. It simply said, "I forgive you for the silence. I love you. And I'm moving forward with peace." Then she did something even braver. She picked up her paintbrush again. She hadn't painted in over a decade. But that day, she opened a blank canvas and poured herself into her work. She joined a local art group, started displaying her paintings at community events, and for the first time in years, she felt vibrant again. Months later, Claire showed up at her door. Not out of guilt, but out of curiosity. "Mom," she said, "I saw your paintings online. They're beautiful. Why didn't you tell me you were doing all this?" Mrs. Bennett smiled and replied, "Because I wasn't waiting anymore." That's the beauty of forgiving without forgetting your worth. You don't excuse the hurt. You simply let go of what's holding you back and start building the life you deserve. And sometimes that quiet strength is what inspires others to return, not because you pulled them, but because they're drawn to who you've become. Forgiveness is not about giving people a free pass. It's about unburdening your own heart so you can move forward, stronger, lighter, and freer. And when you combine that with a renewed sense of self, there's one more piece that makes a world of difference: connection. Not just with your kids, but with the world around you. Loneliness can be one of the hardest parts of aging. You might not talk about it out loud, but deep down, you feel it. That empty chair at the kitchen table. That silence after the TV goes off. It creeps in slowly until one day, you realize you've been waiting, hoping for someone to fill that gap. But here's the thing. Depending on your children to meet all your emotional needs can actually make things harder. It can create pressure and resentment, especially if they're not in a place to give you what you're asking for. That's why building a new circle of companionship can change everything. Mr. Thompson knew this firsthand. After his wife passed, he leaned heavily on his 2 kids for emotional support. He'd call every day, sometimes just to hear their voices. At first, they answered. But over time, their tone changed. Shorter calls, less patience, and eventually, the quiet. It crushed him. Until one day, after a long, lonely afternoon, He did something small but bold. He walked into the local senior center and signed up for their Thursday morning coffee group. He didn't know anyone, but he figured a free donut and some friendly faces couldn't hurt. That one step turned into something beautiful. He met people with stories like his. They shared laughter, advice, even swapped recipes. He joined a walking group, a book club, and started looking forward to his weeks in a way he hadn't for years. And something else happened. Without realizing it, he stopped depending on his kids for everything. He still loved them, of course. He still wanted to hear from them. But the emptiness wasn't so sharp anymore. He had friends now, people who cared, who showed up, who made him feel seen. And wouldn't you know it? His kids started calling again. Not because he pressured them, but because they missed him. Because now, when they talked, he sounded different, lighter, happier. When you build a life that doesn't revolve around being needed, but around being fulfilled, it shifts the balance. You become someone who brings energy into a conversation, not someone waiting for it. And that changes everything. So if your phone hasn't rung in days, or you're tired of sitting in silence, take that brave first step. Say yes to a community event. Strike up a conversation with a neighbor. Sign up for a class, even if you don't know a soul there. The people you're meant to connect with are out there, but they can't find you if you're always hidden behind closed doors. And now, as we bring this conversation to a close, I want to leave you with this. You are not invisible. You are not powerless. And you are certainly not forgotten. Yes, relationships with our children can be complicated. Yes, aging can bring challenges we never expected. But your dignity, your worth, your light, those are yours to carry. And the moment you decide to reclaim them, everything begins to shift. So take a breath. Stand tall. Live your life with purpose, with boundaries, with joy. And if your children come back to you, let it be because they're drawn to the beautiful, full life you've built, not because you begged them to notice. If this message touched your heart today, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Type a 9 if you're ready to embrace these steps, or a 0 if you're just starting to reflect. Your story matters, and you're not alone. And if you found this video helpful, go ahead and click like and subscribe to our channel, Strong Elderly Life, for more conversations just like this one. Here's to living with grace, wisdom, and joy, because you deserve nothing less. See you in the next video.